Hello and welcome to Owning the Narrative. I am Bulow. The show will feature the top news of the week, complete with my observations, and even a little bit of sarcasm thrown in. The top news stories will be taken from my morning news briefings that I write on the Rick Bulow New Media blog every weekday morning. If you go on to like what you see, smash that thumbs up button. And now, let's go right into the news. There are some people who say that the coronavirus or COVID-19 virus had come from a lab. There's some that say it comes from animals, but there is startling developments on that. This coming from Reason.com and the Volo conspiracy. Michael Abramovich was the new coronavirus accidentally released from a Wuhan lab. The Washington Post, and by the way, this is from May 6th. The Washington Post fact checker provides a thorough discussion of the relevant facts concerning whether the COVID-19 pandemic is a result of a lab accident in Wuhan. By the time I reached the conclusion, I was convinced that it almost certainly is, and then I reached the article's conclusion. The balance of the scientific evidence strongly supports the conclusion that the new coronavirus emerged from nature, be it the Wuhan market or somewhere else. Too many unexpected coincidences would have had to take place for it to have escaped from a lab. Now this conclusion is puzzling. The video accompanying the article acknowledges that it is a coincidence that the disease emerged from the same city where coronavirus bats are studied. But the video and article point to a much bigger coincidence. The Wuhan Center for Disease Control and Prevention, where researchers engaged in bad research without using appropriate protective equipment, was right around the corner from the Wuhan seafood market. The location tied to multiple initial carriers of the virus, apparently fewer than 300 meters. So I had to get a little bit of liquid refreshment in there. Now let's do some simple math. First, let's try to make concrete the power of Michel Trottier McDonald that we long expected the possibility of a pandemic. And so we should have something stronger, and so we should have a strong prior that a pandemic that actually occurs as a result of something other than an accident. Now let's assume that labs studying bats are actually very safe, despite the safety violations documented by the fact checker. More specifically, that the probability of a lab somewhere in the world causes a bad coronavirus pandemic in a given year is only 1 in 100,000. Now, and let's assume that non-laboratory zoonosis was ex ante much more likely, with perhaps a 1/1000th chance of producing a pandemic in a given year. So, with no other evidence, when a pandemic occurs, we can include P accident pandemic equals P accident divided by P accident plus P zoonosis equals 0.0099. Moreover, let's suppose that there are 20 labs worldwide, just a wild guess, my guess is it's on the high side, that study coronaviruses in bats. So the probability that any one lab is responsible, which we can donate, P times WCDCP, when speaking of the Wuhan Center for Disease Control and Prevention, is approximately 5/10,000%. From this vantage point, the idea that the virus escaped from the lab does look like a conspiracy theory. But then we need to account for the coincidence that the first location associated with the outbreak was in a 300-meter radius. As some guy comments in response to Trottier McDonald, surely this should figure in the calculus. We can calculate the probability that this neighborhood would be the P neighborhood slash WCDCP times P WCDCP plus P neighborhood slash approximately WCDCP times P approximately WCDCP. That is the unconditional probability that a bad coronavirus pandemic would first be associated with this particular neighborhood is equal to the probability that this would occur, assuming that the coronavirus originated in that lab, multiplied by the probability that the coronavirus originated in that lab, plus the probability that the pandemic would first be associated with this particular neighborhood, assuming that the coronavirus did not originate in that lab, multiplied by the unconditional probability that the coronavirus did not originate in that lab. So let's suppose that there's a 50% chance that an accident at the WCDCP would lead to the pandemic first being observed in that neighborhood. So P neighborhood equals 0.5 times 0.0005 plus P neighborhood approximate WCDCP times 0.9995. And it goes into a lot of other scientific numbers. I'm gonna leave the article in the description below, along with other articles that I'm talking about today. But yeah, basically it goes on to say that, while it seems to me highly unlikely that the virus release was intentional, origination in the lab might nonetheless reasonably focus attention on bioterrorism. Modern genetic technology certainly makes it more likely that scientists, intentionally or by accident, could create stronger strains of viruses. Now that we have seen what a naturally occurring virus can do, the possibility of a man-made virus worse than the novel coronavirus should terrify us, perhaps even posing an existential threat on the same order of magnitude as climate change. Yeah, like I said, the entire article is linked in the description below if you want to check that out. But there's also this from Bonchi over at Red State, entitled, "Was the Wuhan Lab leak theory just confirmed?" This is turning into a banner day for evidence supporting the theory that the COVID-19 pandemic was the result of the virus leaking from a lab in Wuhan, China. Earlier today, Red State reported on the surprising flip-flop from the exalted Dr. Anthony Fauci. After over a year of dismissing the idea that the COVID-19 virus leaked from a lab, either purposely or inadvertently, Fauci's now not convinced that the virus originated in nature. Then there is a link to Fauci admits he's not convinced COVID-19 developed naturally, could have leaked from lab. His change of heart is especially rich, given how combative he's been with Senator Rand Paul about the issue. Irregardless, there is far more to go on here than Fauci's opinions. The GOP House Intel Committee members pull out a report pointing to circumstantial evidence of a leak. Now another big piece of news may be one of the final pieces of the puzzle. WSJ exclusive. Three researchers from China's Wuhan Institute of Virology became sick enough in November 2019 that they sought hospital care, according to a previously undisclosed intelligence report. This coming from Anthony DeRosa, tweeted today. And the pullout quote, Washington, 3 researchers from China's Wuhan Institute of Virology became sick enough in November 2019 that they sought hospital care, according to a previously undisclosed U.S. intelligence report that could add weight to growing calls for a fuller probe of whether the COVID-19 virus may have escaped from the laboratory. The results of the reporting go beyond a State Department fact sheet issued during the final days of the Trump administration, which said that several researchers at the lab, a Center for the Study of Coronaviruses and Other Pathogens, became sick in autumn 2019 with symptoms consistent with both COVID-19 and common seasonal illnesses. Now again, this is circumstantial, but if you were expecting the Chinese to come out and give any direct evidence that they could have been responsible for COVID-19 being leaked from a lab, then you are delusional. This is as good a piece of information as we're going to get from the CCP as far as any confirmation that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was in possession of what we now know as SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19. Why else would these workers at the lab get sick with COVID-19 symptoms and get sick enough that they sought treatment at a hospital before the virus was even in the general public in Wuhan? Occam's razor says it's obviously because they were manipulating the virus latent. These were the patent or patient zeros. Whether that work was being done as some type of bioweapon development is another question, but regardless, a leak is a leak. Editors note the CCP claims that none of the workers in the lab tested positive for coronavirus antibodies and that there has been no employee turnover, but it's unclear who administered any tests the CCP claims were administered or how the validity of these alleged tests were determined. Besides, the lab leak theory just makes the most sense. The bat that COVID-19 supposedly comes from isn't even native to Wuhan, existing hundreds of miles away. Further, if this came from a wet market, why would China not close the wet markets? It seems clear that they know what really happened and that their actions have been based on that, i.e. the wet market stayed open, but they sought to stop any real investigation in the Wuhan lab. But perhaps the real scandal here, at least on this side of the ocean, is how the media and left-wing politicians and bureaucrats have systematically sought to suppress all questions surrounding the Wuhan lab. I've lost track of how many fawning profiles of Fauci I've seen during the media claiming he smacked down Rand Paul during the hearing on May 11, even though the science and probabilities have clearly been on Paul's side. The tides are shifting, and a lot of people who fancy themselves experts now have eggs on their faces. They shouldn't be allowed to suddenly shift sides, but should be held accountable for their illiberalism and censorship of legitimate questions and ideas. And that's that from Red State, but yeah, I mean, this is rather interesting, and a lot of people have said that, this is a bioweapon and that this is have been leaked from bats, and it looked like it looked like it had come out. I mean, even the World Health Organization is speaking on that. This coming from the Associated Press, and it says WHO report like COVID likely first jumped from human or into humans from animals. This by Jamie Keaton and Ken Moritsugu. A joint World Health Organization China study on the origins of COVID-19 says that transmission of the disease from bats to humans to another animal is the most likely scenario, and that a lab leak is extremely unlikely. According to a draft copy obtained by the Associated Press, the findings offer little new insight into how the virus first emerged and leave many questions unanswered, but the report does provide more detail on the reasoning behind the researchers' conclusions. The team proposed further research in every area except the lab leak hypothesis, a speculative theory that was promoted by former U.S. President Donald Trump, among others. It also said that the role played by a seafood market where human cases were first identified were uncertain. Dr. Anthony Fauci, the top U.S. infectious disease expert, said he would like to consider the report's raw information first before deciding about its credibility. I'd also would like to inquire as to the extent in which the people who were on that group had access directly to the data that they would need to make a determination, he said. I want to read the report first and then get a feel for what they really had access to or did not have access to. The report, which is expected to be made public Tuesday, is being closely watched since discovering the origins of the virus could help scientists prevent future pandemics, but it's also extremely sensitive since China bristles at any suggestion that it is to blame for the current one. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said experts from 7 different U.S. government organizations, including the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the National Institute of Health, and the Department of Homeland Security, have the report in hand. 17 reports, long-standing leaders from the field, including epidemiology, public health, clinical medicine, veterinary medicine, infectious disease, law, food security, biosafety, biosecurity. We have a lot of experts in government. We'll be reviewing this report intensively and quickly, she said at a daily briefing. Matthew Cavanaugh of Georgetown University said the report deepened the understanding of the virus's origins, but that more information was needed. It's clear that the Chinese government has not provided all the data needed, and until they do, firm conclusions will be difficult, he said in a statement. Last year, an AP investigation found the Chinese government was strictly controlling all research into its origins, and reported delays into the report's release have raised questions about whether the Chinese side was trying to skew its conclusions. We've got real concerns about the methodology and the process that went into that report, including the fact that the government in Beijing apparently helped to write it, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said in a recent U.S. or CNN interview. China rejected that criticism Monday. The U.S. has been speaking out on the report. By doing this, isn't the U.S. trying to exert political pressure on the members of the WHO expert group? Said Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian. Still, suspicion of China has helped fuel the theory that the virus escaped from a lab in Wuhan, the Chinese city where the virus was first identified. The report cited several reasons for all but dismissing that possibility. It is said that such laboratory accidents are rare, that the labs in Wuhan were well managed, and that there is no need for viruses closely related to the coronavirus in any laboratory before December 2019. The report is based largely on a visit by a WHO team of international experts to Wuhan. The mission was never meant to identify the exact natural source of the virus, an endeavor that typically takes years. For instance, more than 40 years of study has still failed to pinpoint the exact species of bat that are the natural reservoir of Ebola. In the draft obtained by the AP, the researchers listed 4 scenarios in order of likelihood for the emergence of the new coronavirus. Topping the list was transmission from bats to another animal, which they said was likely to very likely. They evaluated direct spread from bats to humans as likely, and said that spread to humans from the packaging of cold chain food products was possible but not likely. That last possibility was previously dismissed by the WHO and the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, but researchers on this mission have taken it up again, further raising questions about the politicization of the study, since China has long pushed the theory. Now, while it's possible that an infected animal contained packaging that was then brought to Wuhan and infected humans, the report said the probability is very low. Mark Wohlhuis, an epidemiologist at the University of Edinburgh, said that even very low probability was an overstatement. There's no compelling evidence of people actually being infected through packaging, he said, calling the theory far-fetched. Wohlhuis said it was possible the source of COVID-19 might never be identified. The emergence of a new disease is always a sequence of unlikely events, he said. It's hard to be definitive and rule anything out, but he said most scientists agree that bats are the most likely source. Bats are known to carry coronavirus, and in fact, the closest relative of the virus that causes COVID-19 has been found in bats. The report said slightly similar viruses have been found in panalogens, a scaly anteater prized in traditional Chinese medicine, but scientists have yet to identify the same coronavirus in animals that's been infecting humans. The AP received a draft copy on Monday from a Geneva-based diplomat from a WHO member country, and it wasn't clear whether the report might still be changed prior to release, though the diplomat said it was a final version. The second diplomat confirmed getting the report too. Both refused to be identified because they were not authorized to release it ahead of publication. WHO Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus acknowledged that he received the report over the weekend and said it would be formally presented Tuesday. All hypotheses are on the table and more complete and further studies, he said at a news conference. The report is inconclusive on whether the outbreak occurred at a Wuhan seafood market that had one of the earliest clusters of human cases in December 2019. Research published last year in the journal Lancet suggested that the market may merely serve to further spread the disease rather than being its source. The market was an early suspect because some stalls sold a range of unusual animals, and some wondered if they had brought the new virus to Wuhan. The report noted the animal products, including everything from bamboo rats to deer, often frozen, were sold at the markets, as were live crocodiles. And there's this from BizPack Review. WSJ reports that 3 Wuhan Lab workers were hospitalized in November of 2019 before official outbreak. Questions about the origins of COVID-19 have suddenly taken on new life here after having long been all but declared verboten, and a report by the Wall Street Journal is kicking those doors wide open. The bombshell report published on Sunday cited a U.S. intelligence report to say that 3 Wuhan Institute of Virology researchers became sick enough in November 2019 that they sought hospital care, adding that the development could add to calls for a fuller probe of whether the COVID-19 virus may have escaped from the lab. The reported date of the hospital visit was just before the confirmed outbreak of the coronavirus, which was first reported in Wuhan in December 2019. There were reportedly differing views from current and former officials familiar with the intelligence about the strength of the supporting evidence, with one source stating, "It was provided by an international partner and was potentially significant, but still in need of a further investigation and additional corroboration," the journal reported. Another source described the intelligence as stronger, saying, "The information that we had coming from the various sources was of exquisite quality. It was very precise, but it didn't tell you was exactly why they got sick." More from the WSJ. The details of the reporting go beyond the State Department fact sheet issued during the final days of the Trump administration, which said that several researchers at the lab, a Center for the Study of Coronaviruses and Other Pathogens, had become sick in autumn 2019 with symptoms consistent with both COVID-19 and common seasonal illness. The disclosure of the number of researchers, the timing of their illnesses, and their hospital visits came on the eve of a meeting of the World Health Organization's decision-making body, which is expected to discuss the next phase of investigation into COVID-19's origins. Even Dr. Anthony Fauci, director of the National Institute of Allergies and Infectious Diseases, has suddenly decided he's not convinced that the deadly virus developed naturally and is calling for further investigations into where it emerged. Fauci was asked earlier this month about during a pointer event whether he was confident that COVID-19 developed naturally. "No, actually, I'm not convinced about that," he replied. "I think we should continue to investigate what went on in China until we continue to find out, to the best of our ability, what happened." As for the possibility that COVID-19 evolved from or escaped from a lab, Fauci said that the possibility certainly exists, and I am totally in favor of a full investigation of whether that could have happened. Turns out former President Donald Trump was talking about this element almost 1 year to the day, and wrongly dismissed by the corrupt media. President Trump contradicts the U.S. intel community by claiming he's seen evidence that the coronavirus originated in a Chinese lab. This from CNN Politics, May 1st of last year. The World Health Organization investigated the origins of COVID-19 and said earlier this year that it's highly unlikely the virus leaked from a lab, and more research is necessary. There was only one American on the international team who was reportedly linked to the research going on in the lab. Critics insist the WHO report was fatally flawed. Fox News host Tucker Carlson recently called attention to a piece by Nicholas Wade, whom he identified as one of the world's preeminent science writers, which said the evidence overwhelmingly shows the virus originated in the Wuhan Institute. What's more, Carlson said Fauci has authorized payment for the dangerous gain-of-function research on coronaviruses that was happening in the Chinese lab. Carlson featured Chinese virologist Dr. Li Mingyan on Friday's show, and she stated that she has evidence that COVID-19 was lab-made and was recently or intentionally released by the Chinese government. From my first report, I can present solid evidence that COVID-19 actually is not from nature, Yan said. "I work with the top virologists in the world, so together with my experience, I can tell you that this is created in the lab. This is from owned by the Chinese military, and also it is spread to the world to make such damage. Here's a quick sampling of responses to the story from Twitter. The Quartering tweeted out, "Trump was right," with the link. Brett Weinstein tweeted out, "This revelation puts Dr. Fauci's sudden acceptance of the plausibility of the lab leak hypothesis in a brand new light. Methinks this captain wasn't interested in going down with his ship." Josh Glancy tweeted out, the plot thickens." Nate Silver, my priors, lab leak 60%. Up 20%, natural origin 40%, down 20%. So Murray said the New York Post will accept your apologies now. Facebook fact checkers. Melissa McKenzie, aka Melissa Tweets, good person to follow on Twitter, by the way. Did Fauci not disclose it? Now, all of this is very interesting. I have more on this that they'll speak to tomorrow and possibly on Wednesday, because this is big news that is coming out. Leave a comment down below for what you think about this. Do you think that COVID-19 was manufactured in a lab? Do you think that it could have left from bat to other animal to human? And I'll see you in the next video. Yesterday I talked about the coronavirus or COVID-19 being leaked from a Wuhan lab, and that the Wall Street Journal had reported that 3 Wuhan lab workers were hospitalized in November of 2019 before the official outbreak of COVID-19. There's a little bit more about that and that I had found. In fact, there is this piece from the American Thinker. It says COVID pandemic, or COVID's origins and the systemic corruption of science. For more than a year, honest and impartial scientific exploration of the origins of the COVID-19 virus had been blocked, with consideration of the possibility that it was engineered in the Wuhan Institute of Virology supposedly suppressed, marked as a conspiracy theory. This has had enormous real-world consequences, not merely because it let off the hook China and Dr. Fauci, who approved American money flowing to gain-of-function research there on coronaviruses, but because an engineered virus behaves differently from a naturally evolved one, and this has implications for how it can best be fought. Only with the publication of a rigorous examination of their question by Nicholas Wade, former science editor of the New York Times, has the tide turned, with numbers of established figures retreating from their insistence that the virus could not have come from a lab. Even PolitiFact has withdrawn its fact check that awards a pants on fire rating to a doctor who claimed it came from a lab. In September 2020, Dr. Li Menyan, a virologist and former postdoctoral professor at the University of Hong Kong, repeated the theory on Fox News, saying, "I can present solid scientific evidence to our audience that this virus, COVID-19 SARS-CoV-2 virus, actually is not from nature. It is a man-made virus covered in the lab." PolitiFact gave her a pants on fire rating. How this travesty of scientific inquiry and public discourse came about is a matter of great importance. When science is corrupted, the consequences can be disastrous. Matthew Crawford has written a real-world essay on how this scandal came about, and the reasons he cites have little to do with the malign influence of China on our media, and much to do with systemic problems in the way science is funded. Here are some excerpts from the article that should be read in its entirety. Crawford points his fingers at the guilty parties. Wade points out that the consensus that COVID must have an entirely natural origin is established on 2 early pronouncements, one in The Lancet in early 2020 and the other in Nature Medicine in March 2020. These were op-eds, not scientific papers. Both spoke with certainty about matters which it was impossible to be certain about. Wade writes it later turned out that the Lancet letter had been organized and drafted by Peter Daszak, president of the EcoHealth Alliance of New York. Dr. Daszak's organization funded coronavirus research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. If the SARS-2 virus had indeed escaped from the research he funded, Dr. Daszak would be potentially culpable. The acute conflict of interest was now declared to the Lancet's readers. To the contrary, the letter continued, we have no competing interests. In other words, a guy who was orchestrating research on back coronaviruses at the lab in Wuhan corralled other scientists with similar professional interests into making a declaration to the effect that anyone who mentions the obvious possibility of that the pandemic, which started in Wuhan, might have a connection to the research could only be doing so with bad intentions. That seems a bit sluggish. And there are a few other snippets here. I'll just read a couple more of them. In the catastrophe of the COVID pandemic, something novel and disturbing comes into view. A peculiar form of intellectual intimidation has become prominent in public life in general, and science has not been spared. The letter in the Lancet stated, we stand together to strongly condemn conspiracy theories suggesting that COVID-19 does not have a natural origin. The invocation of conspiracy theory has become a reflex by which incumbents in many domains seek to arrest criticism. And it ends that the resulting moratorium on pursuing the leak or lab leak hypothesis may have been quite consequential, as an engineered virus behaves differently from a naturally evolved one, and this has implications for how it can best be fought. I'll leave a link to this as well as the other articles that I'm going to read today in the description below if you want to check it out. But yeah, I mean, this just goes to show that what people who had said was some people claim is a conspiracy theory is really probably now a scientific fact, and there are many people who might be eating their words, maybe having a little humble pie, who knows about that. But there's this from the Washington Post, or rather this from WorldNet Daily. Headline: Washington Post reporter media dismissed lab leak reports because Trump discussed it. And this by Andrew Kerr from the Daily Caller News Foundation. The corporate press spent much of the pandemic dismissing the theory that COVID-19 could have accidentally leaked from the Wuhan Institute of Virology because former President Donald Trump talked about it. And according to Washington Post senior reporter Aaron Blake, it has become evident that some corners of the mainstream media overcorrected when it came to one particular theory from Trump and his allies, that the coronavirus emanated from a laboratory in Wuhan, China. Instead, naturally, Blake wrote in an analysis piece published Monday. It's also true that many criticisms of his coverage are overwrought, and that Trump's and his allies' claims invited and deserve skepticism. Blake explained that the media was justified in being skeptical of the lab leak theory because Trump and former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo had leaned in hard to the theory without providing even piecemeal evidence to support their claims. Given everything we know about how Trump handles such things, caution and skepticism were invited, Blake wrote. That very much warranted caution, and skepticism spilled over into some oversimplification, especially when it came to summarizing the often more circumspect reporting. Given how the Trump administration handled intelligence, there is very little doubt that, if some kind of proof had existed, Trump would have pushed hard for his release, Blake added. Trump could have done so whenever he wanted. It never happened. The best evidence for it has emerged a year later with Trump out of power. But evidence pointing to the legitimacy of the lab leak theory was printed in the pages of the Washington Post as early as April 2020, when its opinion columnist Josh Rogan revealed that the State Department sent two cables in 2018 warning of safety and management issues at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. One of the cables stated that the WIV's work on bad coronaviruses represented the risk of a new pandemic. And one of the Washington Post quoted experts, Rutgers University molecular biologist Richard Ebright, told the Data College News Foundation in April 2020 that it was entirely possible that the COVID-19 could have been unleashed into the human population due to a leak from the WIV. Rogan was also one of the first to highlight that one of the most outspoken American scientists that spoke out in defense of the WIV during the early stages of the pandemic, Dr. Peter Daszak, had a potential conflict of interest due to his longtime collaboration with the lab. Daszak was responsible for orchestrating a statement in the Lancet Medical Journal in February 2020 that condemned conspiracy theories, suggesting COVID-19 doesn't have a natural origin. A spokesman for Daszak would later reveal to the Wall Street Journal in January that the statement, which was cited by numerous news outlets and by fact-check organizations to censor unwelcome inquiries during the onset of the pandemic, was meant to protect Chinese scientists. The corporate press has made an abrupt about-face in its framing of the lab leak theory in recent weeks after spending the better part of the year casting down the origin theory as a baseless conspiracy. Beck pointed to reporting from the Wall Street Journal on Sunday that 3 researchers from the WIV became so sick in November 2019 that they became hospitalized as the latest piece of evidence, pointing to the legitimacy of the lab leak theory. The journal's report came months after Trump's State Department released a fact sheet on January 15 that claimed that several researchers inside the WIV became sick in autumn 2019 before the first identified case of the outbreak. The symptoms were reportedly consistent with both COVID-19 and common seasonal illnesses. Another early critic of the theory, Dr. Anthony Fauci, told PolitiFact in May that he was not convinced when asked if he was so confident that it developed naturally. PolitiFact also retracted a fact statement from September 2020 in May that had called a Hong Kong virologist claim that COVID-19 was a lab-created virus, a debunk conspiracy theory. An editor's note explaining why PolitiFact removed the fact check from its website stated that the assertion from experts at the time that the virus could not have been manipulated is now more widely disputed. Yeah, many people have been saying that for some time, but many people just either couldn't believe it or needed more proof. And here's the proof right there. And then there's also this from my good friends over at BizPack Review, that says that that media rightly dismissed lab leak theory because some talked about it, according to senior WaPo expert. This from Andrew Kerr of the DCNF. Pretty much, I'm thinking pretty much the same thing that World Net Daily had talked about, but there are a couple of new things. The corporate press spent the better part of the corporate press spent the better part of a year calling the lab leak theory a conspiracy because former President Donald Trump talked about it, according to Washington Post reporter Aaron Blake. It has become evident that some corners of the mainstream media overcorrected when it came to one particular theory from Trump and his allies. The coronavirus emanated from a laboratory in Wuhan, China, rather than naturally, Blake wrote in an analysis piece published Monday. It's also true that many criticisms of the coverage are overwrought and that Trump's and his allies' claims to invited and deserved criticism. And let's see what else it says. Yeah, this pretty much says the same thing. So let's go. So we switch over to the National Review, which says, what if the pandemic was man-made? If COVID is shown to have leaked from a lab, searching for those that authored the disaster would be necessary fact-finding before doing justice. At the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, history-minded columnists started cracking open their books and looking for what happened in plagues of the past. Maybe that would be a guide to the near-term future, and indeed we saw history repeat itself. Some people shutting in for fear of the illness, others behaving or living almost more hedonistically lest they miss out on some of life's joy before the end. Cities emptying of their inhabitants, spreading the disease into the provinces and countryside. We saw New York City seed most of the American nation with coronavirus. In the chronicles of the late Middle Ages, we find ecstatic religious movements taking to the streets to do reparation before God. In 2020, we saw protests around the world. Pandemics can bring rioting, ditto. And in the past, there was scapegoating, usually of Jews. We watched Mayor Bill de Blasio talk or calling out the Orthodox faith community in Brooklyn, even as Black Lives Matter defied social distancing and curfews imposed on everyone else. But we may have something new in a pandemic, a handful of guilty humans and governments. You may have noticed that after a year in which almost every health authority closed ranks to say that it was ridiculous to believe that COVID-19 emerged from a lab in Wuhan, now there is a rush to the microphones and newspapers to at least entertain the lab leak theory. Dr. Fauci himself, who had dismissed the lab escape theory as unscientific, is now saying he is not convinced that COVID emerged in nature or at a wet market. Even the head of the World Health Organization said the lab leak couldn't be ruled out after a WHO investigation that was practically designed to rule out the lab leak theory. Now the Wall Street Journal is reporting that U.S. intelligence had reports in November 2019 that several staff at the Wuhan Lab fell sick and had to be hospitalized. Without getting into the even harder question of whether COVID-19 was deliberately created by human lab workers as part of the gain-of-function experiment, if the lab leak theory is true, then COVID-19 becomes the single worst man-made disaster in human history. Nothing else could remotely be worse. The ultimate death toll from the Chernobyl nuclear disaster is hotly disputed. The immediate death toll is anywhere from 31 to 54, but that just barely touches the effects of radiation, which has affected tens of thousands of people, especially those who were involved in the cleanup and entombment of the site. But even at the furthest end, when we extrapolate generously from measurable upticks in cancers, it is hard to find serious direct harm behind this scale. Perhaps 2 million people, inclusive of those resettled, those who reported any health problems, or those aborted after European health authorities advised such almost immediately after the accident. The Union Carbide chemical plant in Bhopal, India, gassed somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 people to death, and inflicted serious long-term health problems on perhaps 500,000 others. COVID-19 dwarfs these. As of now, the World Health Organization estimates that nearly 3.5 million people have died from COVID-19 globally. Some estimates suggest that between $16 and $28 trillion was lost in global economic output owing to the shutdowns, lockdowns, and supply chain disruptions that followed it. School closures affected 1.6 billion people, and that barely begins to talk about the small but unforgettable losses that lockdowns have imposed on our lives. The lost reunions, the family turmoil, the funerals and weddings never attended. For many, it would be psychologically easier if COVID-19 were a product of nature or the will of nature's God. The cruelty and inscrutability of nature is easier to accept. But what if all this mountain of suffering the last 2 years was a product of bad safety practices at a lab in a city most people had never heard of until 2020? Or if it was partly down to the fault of a political party, the Chinese Communist Party, which, seeking to avoid embarrassment, prevented the world from discovering the nature of this outbreak when there was time to do something to prevent it from going global. Or if it was the fault of the American officials who underwrote gain-of-function research overseas, despite the foreseeable risks of trying to make viruses found in nature more ineffective in human beings. If COVID-19 is a man-made disaster, searching for people, the institutions, and the governments that authored this disaster is not scapegoating. It's necessary fact-finding before doing justice. What might justice look like in practice? It might include global bans on gain-of-function research. This one measure alone would constitute a kind of quiet revolution, an admission that not every kind of scientific research is in fact beneficial to humanity. The reputation of the entire scientific enterprise itself would suffer immensely from the fallout. Now, if it was a gain-of-function research project gone wrong, then the public health officials who supported and authorized it will meet a dramatic fall from the stature that they attained in the past year. And if subsequent research and investigations can show that actions of the Chinese government, its stonewalling and its manipulation of the World Health Organization at the outset of the pandemic contributed to an overall worse global outcome, it might be time to bring up the word reparations and international affairs again. The process of discovery is only just beginning. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, the things are slowly beginning to open up, as many people had mentioned in the past on various shows, all over the internet, and even in some articles. So I'll be following this in the days and months to come. Leave a comment down below what do you think about this? Do you think this is a global, do you think that this should be looked into more? Do you think that we have a right to look into it? What do you think about all of the lockdowns and stuff happening? And I'll see you in the next video. Past couple of days I've been speaking about the Wuhan coronavirus being leaked from a lab, and yet people all last year had said that it is false. Well, here's even more articles. Got this one from my good friends over at the American Thinker. Peter Sturkis tweeted out or had written, "Media proven wrong on COVID origins, but who cares?" Well. It seems the media is another assorted official's insistence that the COVID virus did not escape from the Wuhan Lab was a lie. As Tucker Carlson put it, pretty much every sane person acknowledges at this point that the government of China likely caused the single worst man-made disaster in American history. The evidence is so overwhelming that all the previous authoritative sources are flip-flopping on the issue. One prime example is the Washington Post head fact-checker Glenn Kessler. This man ridiculed anyone who said the virus likely came from the Wuhan Lab, especially singled out President Trump and Senator Ted Cruz. Well, Kessler is not backtracking. Now he's out with a new article on May 25th entitled, "How the Wuhan Lab Leak Theory Suddenly Became Credible," to which Donald Trump Jr. responded in a tweet, "It didn't suddenly become credible, it always was credible." So yes, Trump and Cruz are vindicated. The media narrative has been shown to be wrong, and Dr. Anthony Fauci, the highest paid employee in the U.S. government, has been shown yet again to be a two-faced liar. But what does it matter? The lie and the cover-up on the origin of the Wuhan virus achieved their main objective. They damaged President Trump in the eyes of many voters, which to some degree made it easier to fraudulently install Joe Biden in the Oval Office. And where do the media propagandists care that the truth is now coming out? They got Biden into the presidency. It's the same for the Chinese. Their nemesis Trump is gone. Plus, the Biden family is so dirty and compromised with Chinese money that they have Joe, and by extension the U.S., by the short hairs. This is similar to the Russian hoax. That partisan witch hunt lasted 2 years and did great damage to the country and the Republican cause. It was a factor in the Democrats winning control of the House in 2018. That threw a monkey wrench into the president's Make America Great Again agenda. His time and energy was spent answering S-9 charges and allegations. At the end of the day, Trump was vindicated. But still, the hoax has played a major role in shifting power to the radical Democrats, and things haven't been the same since. It is sad to say, but the lies of the radical Democrats are effective. It doesn't much matter that they have a short shelf life. As long as it rents the left's objective, the Democrats don't care, and you'll notice that none of the liars pays a price for his lies. Misdirection, like the origin of the Chinese virus and the Russian hoax, were effective not because they were so clever. No, they work only because the entire mainstream media are fully complicit in propagating them. Without that, their exposure would be a snap. And that's totally true. I mean, many people last year had mentioned that the whole coronavirus is man-made and came from a lab, this and everything else. And earlier today, I had heard a small snippet from Senator Kennedy of Louisiana, talking to Dr. Fauci, and he brought up something called gain of function research. I think I had brought it up in yesterday's video, but there is this from theblaze.com, and it's entitled, Cheers break out in Senate after Paul Amendment passes banning gain of function research in China. Cheers and applause rang out in the Senate chamber on Tuesday evening after passage of an amendment offered by Kentucky Republican Senator Rand Paul, which bans the use of U.S. taxpayer dollars to fund gain-of-function research in China. We may never know what the pandemic arose from. We may never know whether the pandemic arose from the lab in Wuhan, but we do know that so far no immediate animal host has been discovered. Paul said in his speech ahead of the vote. Thousands of animals at the wet market have been looked at, he continued. None of them have carried COVID-19. We've tried to infect COVID-19 into bats. It doesn't grow well in bats. It seems suitable in humans. He reiterated, we may not know whether this ever rose out of a Wuhan lab, but I think gain-of-function research where we take a deadly virus, sometimes much more deadly than COVID, and then we increase its transmissibility to mammals is wrong. In 2014, National Institutes of Health stopped all of this research, the senator went on to say, adding, I'm using the same definition to say any gain-of-function research should not be funded in China with U.S. taxpayer dollars. The measure then passed by a voice vote, prompting cheers and clapping from within the chamber. Forbes tweeted out, the Senate chamber erupts into cheers after an amendment proposed by Rand Paul that bans U.S. funding of gain-of-function research. In his most recent sparring match with Dr. Anthony Fauci a few weeks ago, Paul, a physician, pressed Fauci over NIH funding viral research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology and the possibility that COVID-19 was a product of gain-of-function research partly from the lab. Dr. Fauci, do you support funding of the NIH funding of the lab in Wuhan? Paul asked. Senator Paul, with all due respect, you are entirely and completely incorrect, Fauci replied. The NIH has not ever and does not now fund gain-of-function research in the Wuhan Institute. Paul disputed Fauci's claim in a press release explaining his amendment, writing, despite Dr. Fauci's denial, there is ample evidence and backing by the scientific community that the NIH and the NIAID, under his direction, funded gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. A multitude of scientists have reviewed this research and said it meets the definition of gain-of-function. Many of these scientists have also discussed the inherent dangers of conducting gain-of-function research and the risk it poses to the human population. So that in and of itself is a victory for people who actually have done the research on this. But as all this is going on, we have the Biden administration shutting down the inquiries. Kind of makes you wonder what they're hiding. Got two articles on that. This one This first one coming from Hot Air. Biden admin shut down Wuhan Lab leak inquiry from CNN. They're singing a different tune, and this is by Ed Morrissey. They're singing a different tune now, but we'll get to that in a minute. CNN reported last night that Joe Biden and the White House shut down a State Department probe into the lab leak theory of COVID-19 origin, supposedly over issues of evidentiary reliability. Now that scientists have rejected China's claim that the Wuhan Institute of Virology had no connection to the pandemic outbreak, news of the abrupt closure of the probe has leaked. The existence of the State Department inquiry and the termination this spring by the Biden administration, neither of which has been previously reported, comes to light amid renewed interest into whether the virus could have leaked out of a Wuhan lab with links to the Chinese military. The Biden administration is also facing scrutiny of its own efforts to determine if the Chinese government was responsible for the virus. Those involved in the previously undisclosed inquiry, which was launched last fall by allies of then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, say it was an honest effort to probe what many initially dismissed, that China's biological weapons program could have had a greater role in the pandemic's origin in Wuhan, according to two additional sources. The decision to terminate the inquiry, which was run primarily out of the State Department's Arms Control and Verification Bureau, was made after Biden officials were briefed on the team's draft findings in February and March this year, a State Department spokesperson said. Questions were raised about the legitimacy of the findings, and the project was deemed to be an ineffective use of resources, explained a source familiar with the decision. Now, that timing is very curious. In February and early March, the Biden team had barely assembled itself, let alone acquire the longitudinal expertise to make these kinds of determinations. Biden himself was complaining, falsely, that he had come into office with no vaccines and no plans for distributing them, and that his team was working overtime to catch up. How would they have had the knowledge to determine that such a probe was an ineffective use of resources? By the end of March, however, Tedros Ghebreyesus burned them. After World Health Organization review dismissed the lab leak hypothesis, he unexpectedly announced that conclusion and demanded further investigation into the WIV's potential role in the COVID-19 outbreak. Ever since, health organizations and media outlets have conducted clampdowns on the repudiation of the potential of a lab leak, and fact checks that castigated advocates of that origin explanation as conspiracy theory nutters. The clampdown now includes the Biden administration. At WHO's annual ministerial meeting yesterday, HHS Secretary Javier Becerra demanded a thorough investigation into WIV and the lab leak hypothesis. The United States' top health official called Tuesday for a swift follow-up investigation into the coronavirus's origins, amid renewed questions about whether the virus jumped down from animal hosts into humans in a naturally occurring event, or escaped from a lab in Wuhan, China. Health and Human Services Secretary Javier Becerra told an annual ministerial meeting of the World Health Organization that international experts should be given the independence to fully assess the source of the virus and the early days of the outbreak. Becerra's remarks, which were pre-recorded, signal that the Biden administration will continue to press the WHO to expand its investigation to determine the virus's origins. Continue? It's clear that Biden and his team didn't want to press for any answers on the Wuhan lab, not until they were forced into it. If they wanted answers, they could have continued the probe that Pompeo launched, replacing investigators with people in which they had more confidence. Instead, they shut it down, probably because they didn't want Donald Trump to get any credit for getting it right. Again. And that leads into this article from CNN. Pompeo-led effort to hunt down COVID lab theory shut down by Biden administration over concerns about quality of evidence. And this coming from Kylie Atwood. President Joe Biden's team shut down a closely held State Department effort launched later in the Trump administration to prove the coronavirus originated in a Chinese lab over concerns about the quality of its work. according to three sources familiar with the decision. The existence of the State Department inquiry and its termination this spring by the Biden administration, neither of which has been previously reported, comes to light amid renewed interest in whether the virus could have leaked out of a Wuhan lab with links to the Chinese military. The Biden administration is also facing scrutiny of its own efforts to determine if the Chinese government was responsible for the virus. Those involved in the previously undisclosed inquiry, which was launched last fall by allies of then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, say it was an honest effort to probe what many initially dismissed, that China's biological weapons program could have had a greater role in the pandemic's origin in Wuhan, according to two additional sources. But the inquiry quickly became mired in internal discord and made concerns that it was part of a broader politicized effort by the Trump administration to blame China and cherry-pick facts to prove a theory. That the decision to terminate the inquiry, which was run primarily out of the State Department's Arms Control and Verification Bureau, was made after Biden officials were briefed on the team's draft findings in February and March of this year. A State Department spokesperson said, questions were raised about the legitimacy of the findings, and the project was deemed to be an ineffective use of resources, explained a source familiar with the decision. Sources involved in the Trump-era inquiry rejected criticisms over the quality of their work and told CNN that their objective had been to examine scientific research and information from the U.S. intelligence community, which backed the lab leak theory and shone more light on how it could have emerged in the lab. A day after CNN reported this story, the State Department disputed that it had shut down the Trump-era inquiry and instead said that its work had been completed. Several sources involved with the inquiry who spoke to CNN said it was their impression that there was more work to be done. On Wednesday, Biden issued a statement that he has directed the U.S. intelligence community to redouble its efforts in investigating the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic and report back to him in 90 days. Though Biden officials shut down this particular inquiry, they remain skeptical of Beijing's role in limiting investigators from accessing information which may be pertinent to the origins of the virus. U.S. intelligence agencies continue to examine the question of whether the virus emerged naturally from human contact with infected animals, or if it could have been the result of a laboratory accident. One U.S. intelligence report, which CNN and the Wall Street Journal recently reported on, found that several researchers at China's Wuhan Institute of Virology fell ill in November 2019 and had to be hospitalized. A new detail which has fueled a continued debate about the virus's origin. The exact nature of their symptoms remain unclear. A State Department spokesperson confirmed work on the inquiry had stopped, saying even though this discrete project has concluded, the State Department continues to work with the interagency to look into the COVID origins issue. The State Department project began in May 2020, months after Pompeo and President Donald Trump first claimed that the virus could have originated from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. In May 2020, Pompeo claimed that there was enormous evidence and a significant amount of evidence to support the claim, despite the U.S. intelligence community saying that there was no definitive answer as to precisely where and how the virus began transmitting. Pompeo did not respond to CNN's request for comment. Now, the inquiry also came amid a broader effort by some in the Trump administration to look for ways to blame the Chinese government for the outbreak and affect responsibility from its own handling of the virus, which had claimed over 200,000 lives by Election Day in November. As Trump and Pompeo regularly spoke about the China virus, there continue suggestions that the virus originated in a lab, raised concerns among some State Department and intelligence officials over what they viewed as attempts to politicize what little the U.S. knew about the virus's origins, but those involved in the effort looked at it as more of a need to probe unanswered questions, rather than a politically motivated program. Still, though, the quiet inquiry eventually became a contentious issue at the State Department during the few months it was active. Proponents of the effort, including Pompeo himself, argued that potential connection between the Chinese military and the pandemic needed to be investigated and that the administration was justified to include the inquiry in the State Department's ongoing and legally mandated review of countries' compliance with arms control treaties according to 4 sources familiar with the matter. Officials involved in the effort relied on scientific research as well as public and classified information to probe the lab leak theory, including looking into any possible connection between the virus and the Chinese government's biological weapons program. 3 of the sources told CNN. The Chinese government is party to the major international agreements regulating biological weapons, which prohibit developing, producing, transferring, or stockpiling of bacteriological and toxin weapons. The U.S. government has said that it believes China maintained an offensive biological weapons program even after joining the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention in 1984. China refutes this. Dr. Anthony Fauci recently said he is not convinced that COVID-19 developed naturally, but last spring he said that the U.S. strongly leaned toward the idea that the virus could not have been artificially or deliberately manipulated. Officials involved in the State Department inquiry believed Fauci's initial comments last year were baseless. People in the U.S. government were working on the question of where COVID-19 came from, but there was no other effort that we knew of that took the lab leak possibility seriously enough to focus into digging in certain aspects, questions, and uncertainties, said David Faith, a former senior State Department official who was briefed on the efforts. Opponents of the State Department inquiry viewed the effort as alarming because those working on it appear to actively hide their work from skeptics, 2 sources said. The way they did their work was suspicious as hell, said one former State Department official who was familiar with the effort. They basically conducted it in secret, cutting out the State Department's technical experts and the intelligence community, and then trying to brief certain senior officials on the interagency on their tentative conclusions even before they let the department leaders they worked for know an investigation was underway at all. During the final weeks of the Trump administration, when senior officials in the department who had been shielded from the efforts learned about how far the inquiry had gone, they pushed for a panel of outside scientists to review the findings. When scientists looked at the data during a 3-hour-long meeting in early January, the evidence collected up until that point appeared inconclusive and misguided, 2 sources said. It smelled like they were just fishing to justify predetermined conclusions and cut out experts who would critique their science, said the former official familiar with the effort. The reason for all this became clear when real scientists finally got a chance to see their analysis, and the inquiry's statistical case fell apart. The briefing prompted then Assistant Secretary Chris Ford to send a memo to a handful of department officials, including top leadership, urging caution about the group's findings. Ford called aspects of the analysis greatly flawed and urged officials against suggesting that there is anything inherently suspicious, and suggested a biological warfare activity, about People's Liberation Army involvement at WIV on classified projects. But those involved in the project, who said that they relied on the intelligence community throughout their inquiry, defended their efforts. A scientific consulting process involved dissenting perspectives on purpose, said one source involved in the project. It was meeting with deliberative disagreement. There was a total misunderstanding of the entire process. We used experts and one specific team of experts, but there was no consensus in the IC, said a second former official working on the effort. The IC was saying this is a public health issue and this has nothing to do with biological weapons. Well, we said, how do we know that? Pompeo put out a statement as the Trump administration was leaving office that said the U.S. had a determined collaboration between the Wuhan Lab, where COVID-19 research has been conducted on bats, and secret Chinese military projects. The process beyond declassifying the intelligence in that statement took weeks, and certain details were scrubbed from the final version, which was put out. Sources familiar with the process told CNN. The State Department's small group looking into the lab leak theory contributed to that fact sheet, but most of its information came from the U.S. intelligence community, sources told CNN. When the Biden administration took office, it did not see any significant doubts in the data points featured in the fact sheet Pompeo put out. According to one source familiar, The information was vetted by the intelligence community, but it was also a select few data points from a mountain of data in which the Biden administration viewed as a deliberate effort to put more weight into the lab leak theory, while they ignored information suggesting that the virus spread naturally to animals from humans. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has been vocal in criticizing the World Health Organization's efforts thus far, which have been inhibited by the Chinese government in restricting their access. Going forward, all countries, including China, should participate in a transparent and robust process for preventing and responding to health emergencies so that the world learns as much as possible as soon as possible, Sullivan said in February. The State Department has echoed those calls. The Biden administration's effort to investigate the origins of the pandemic is primarily focused on rallying pressure and support for the WHO's investigation to be transparent and fulsome, explained a Biden administration official. The WHO, too, has said that the theory needs more investigation and more access is required. Biden national security officials have also stated publicly that the U.S. intelligence community does not have any solid details about the origin of the virus. It is absolutely accurate. The intelligence community does not know exactly where, when, or how COVID-19 virus was transmitted initially. U.S. Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines said last month during a congressional briefing, despite continued calls for the need to understand what caused the COVID-19 outbreak more clearly as a way of preventing a future pandemic, the U.S. still is far from understanding its precise origin. It appears that we do not understand the emergence of COVID-19 any better than we did 6 to 9 months ago. The world needs to learn as much as possible about the earliest days of the COVID-19 pandemic to better prepare our governments, our people, and our public health institutions for the next health crisis, the State Department spokesperson said. Now, I find this to be rather tenuous, rather interesting. Make of it what you will, but the truth is coming out slowly, and once it does, we should be, hopefully former President Trump will be vindicated in this, but again, who knows? Let me know down in the comment section below what you think about all this. With all of this coming out, do you have a better feel of what COVID-19 actually is? Do you want to learn more? Given all this, do you think that it should have been nipped in the bud early last year? Let me know in the comments down below, and I'll see you in the next video. All this week I've been talking about what President Trump had been talking about all last year, that being that the coronavirus, aka COVID-19, has been created in a lab. And what if the lab leak theory is right? Well, there's more articles on it. I got this from my good friends over at Conservative Daily News. Lunatic conspiracy theories. Here's how liberal fact checkers treated people who supported lab leak theory. A few bullet points. The liberal media fact checkers were quick to label reporters and lawmakers who supported the lab leak theory as conspiracy theorists. In the wake of the 2020 coronavirus outbreak, we can't disregard these as lunatic conspiracy theories on the fringes, fairness and accuracy in reporting. A progressive media watchdog stated in an April 2020 article about the lab leak theory, these speculations, rumors, and outright lies have a way of stirring in partisan media. Interestingly enough, Republican Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton was labeled a conspiracy theorist by liberal outlets, which dismissed his arguments that coronavirus may have escaped from a lab in Wuhan, China. And here's the article. Liberal media fact checkers were quick to label reporters and lawmakers who supported the lab leak theory as conspiracy theorists in the wake of the 2020 coronavirus outbreak. Fact checkers repeatedly labeled contents and reporting that it referenced evidence of a lab leak theory, the hypothesis that coronavirus came from a Wuhan, China lab instead of a food market, as harmful misinformation. Recently, however, evidence that 3 Wuhan Institute of Virology researchers were hospitalized with an unknown illness in November of 2019 has been revealed has been revealed, suggesting that the theory isn't baseless. Beijing has claimed that the virus originated in a Wuhan wet market where wild animals were sold. Republican Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton wrote in an April 2020 Wall Street Journal report, but evidence seeking to counter this theory emerged in January. This evidence is circumstantial to be sure, but it all points toward the Wuhan labs, he said. Thanks to the Chinese cover-up, we may never have direct, conclusive evidence. Intelligence rarely works that way, but Americans justifiably can use common sense to follow the inherent logic of events to their likely conclusion. In response, Cotton was labeled a conspiracy theorist by many liberal outlets, which dismissed his arguments. A Vanity Fair article accused Cotton of adding a scary new layer to Donald Trump's blame China strategy. The BBC reported that his claims were unfounded, and a Snopes fact check characterized his allegations as speculative. We cannot disregard these as lunatic conspiracy theories on the fringes. Fairness and accuracy in reporting, a progressive media watchdog stated in an April 2020 article about the lab leak theory. These speculations, rumors, and outright lies have a way of staying in partisan media and bubbling up to a level where they affect our political discourse and public health. Former President Donald Trump, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and Republican Texas Senator Ted Cruz were also criticized for bringing attention to the lab leak theory. Washington Post fact-check editor Glenn Kessler criticized Cruz in May 2020 after the senator suggested that the virus may have leaked from the Wuhan lab. Kessler said it was virtually impossible that the virus jumped from the lab. We deal in facts and viewers can judge for themselves, Kessler added. The New York Times said the chances Trump and Pompeo were correct in their assertions that the coronavirus may stem from the Wuhan lab were slim. In a May 2020 article, Axios reported that, based on comments made by Anthony Fauci and the U.S. intelligence community, it was safe to say that the virus evolved naturally, and Pierre even interviewed experts who worry that Trump administration's apparent support for the Wuhan lab theory, or lab leak theory, paralleled the government's messaging that ultimately led to the invasion of Iraq. The NYT also made a comparison between Trump's support for the lab leak theory and former President George W. Bush's administration, insisting Saddam Hussein was developing weapons of mass destruction in the early 2000s. Altogether, the NYT, Reuters, CNN, The Washington Post, NBC News, NPR, PolitiFact, Snopes, The Guardian, Vox, Vanity Fair, and other outlets all published articles casting doubt on the lab leak theory. Some have recently posted editor's notes backtracking on their original reporting. Now, while liberal news outlets and fact-checkers repeatedly downplayed both the lab leak theory and those who supported it, outlets like the Washington Times and Daily Caller News Foundation investigated the theory rather than dismissing it, but Facebook suppressed such reporting by labeling it with a false information tag according to various outlets. In February 2020, Facebook suppressed a New York Post editorial that called the lab leak hypothesis a theory, the Post reported. The social media platform's fact-checkers also labeled a Washington Times article, which has since been confirmed by other outlets. Reporter Bill Gertz recently said, meanwhile, President Joe Biden asked U.S. intelligence agencies to redouble their efforts into the investigation and the origins of coronavirus. He said in a statement Wednesday, he ordered them to give him a detailed report listing their findings within 90 days. Now, interestingly enough, there have been other news outlets that had talked about it and even supported it, but they've been labeled as conspiracy theorists and fearmongers as well. But with all this coming out, they may be vindicated after all. And there's this interesting question from The Atlantic, which is entitled, "If the lab leak theory is right, what next?" This by Daniel Engber. Last summer, Michael Imperiale, a University of Michigan virologist and tenure member of the National Science Advisory Board for Biosecurity, published an essay on the need to rethink some basic research safety practices in light of the coronavirus pandemic. But he and his co-author, another Biosecurity Board veteran, did want to make one thing clear. There was no reason to believe that sloppy or malicious science had anything to do with the outbreak of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. To suggest otherwise was more akin to a conspiracy theory than to a scientifically credible hypothesis. 9 months later, Imperiale has a somewhat different view. In my mind, the preponderance of the evidence still points toward a natural origin, he told me earlier this month, but the data between the nature evidence and the lab escape evidence appears to be shrinking. Indeed, a slow sedimentation of doubts about COVID-19's origin, whether the virus that causes it jumped directly from bats or the wild animals or made a pit stop on a lab bench in Wuhan, China, has lately turned into a flood. In just the past 2 weeks, deltas have been in flux, not just among the nation's leading biosafety experts, but also among public health officials, pundits, and journalists at major dailies. The assertion by World Health Organization investigators in February that a lab leak origin for the pandemic was extremely unlikely has been challenged by the WHO Director General Tedros Ghebreyesus. A May 14 letter to Science magazine signed by 18 scientists called for proper investigation and dispassionate science-based discourse on this difficult but important issue. David Frum suggested last week in The Atlantic that the Biden administration should take possession of the truth about the virus, and the elections forecaster Nate Silver declared on Sunday that his estimated likelihood of a laboratory origin has increased by half to 60%. Today, President Joe Biden said that the United States intelligence community still hasn't decided which hypothesis is likelier, and that he wants to get closer to a definitive conclusion by the end of August. This shift is all the more remarkable for its lack of any major associated revelations. Arguments in favor of the lab leak hypothesis remain grounded, as they ever were, in the mere and highly suspicious fact that a coronavirus likely born by bats, likely from a cave in southwest China, emerged 18 months ago quite suddenly in a city very far from southwest China, where researchers had assembled an archive of cave bat-borne coronaviruses. Much of the rest is window dressing. That the lab leak hypothesis is gaining currency, even as the facts remain the same, has a useful implication, though. It suggests that definitive proof is not an absolute requirement. The SARS-CoV-2 outbreak has killed millions of people. It might have started in the wild, or it might have started in a lab. We know enough to acknowledge that the second scenario is possible, and we should therefore act as though it's true. According to the May 14 letter to Science, the one demanding a proper investigation into COVID-19's origins, knowing how COVID-19 emerged and is critical for informing global strategies to mitigate the risk of future outbreaks. Just about every magazine story, Substack post, and piece of commentary about the lab leak hypothesis includes a line like this: drop like a smoke bomb right up near the top. Did COVID-19 emerge from wildlife, or might the virus have slipped out from a lab? That urgent question is key to preventing the emergence of SARS-CoV-3, or COVID-29 began when featured from March. It matters a lot because knowing how a virus-driven pandemic begins focuses our attention on preventing similar situations, another article said in April, and it matters a great deal, which is the case if we hope to prevent a second such occurrence. The science journalist Nicholas Wade wrote in a widely read essay earlier this month. Sorry about that, had to get a little bit of liquid refreshment. Now that's a simple and convincing notion. The project to identify the source of the coronavirus pandemic surely has moral, legal, and political significance, but with regard to global public health and to the crucial project of pandemic proofing for the future, its outcome matters only at the margins. To say that we'll need to know the exact origin of SARS-CoV-2 in order to set policies for saving our SARS-CoV-3 commits us to the path of hindsight bias. It's a pledge to keep on fighting the last war against emerging pathogens, if not a blueprint for constructing the next Maginot Line. What information, really, would we get from a proper investigation? While at best we'll have identified one more place to look for natural spillovers, or one more type of catastrophic accident, or useful data, sure, but in the broader sense, it's another case study added to a paltry set. Of the smattering of pandemics in the past century, one, the 1977 Russian flu, has been cited as the possible result of a laboratory accident. What we might discover about the genesis of COVID-19 and whether we discover anything at all, this historical record is bound to look more or less the same. Nearly all pandemics appear to have a natural source. Possibly one or two have emerged, and more might do so in the future from research settings. Now, instead of calling for a new and better inquiry into origins, let's stipulate that pandemics can result from natural spillovers or from laboratory accidents, and then let's move along to implications. One important question has already gotten airtime from right-wing media, at least. Should scientists be fiddling with pathogenic genomes to measure out the steps they'd have to take before ascending to pandemic-level virulence? Should the National Institutes of Health be funding them? This was the subject of a fierce, unresolved debate among virologists as started back in 2012, and it still isn't clear to what extent such research helps prevent devastating outbreaks, and to what extent it poses a realistic risk of creating them. Other questions include, should coronavirus samples be gathered from the wild to be studied at moderate biosafety levels, as appears to have been the case at the Wuhan Institute of Virology? Is there any significant cost in terms of preparing for the next pandemic from slowing down surveillance work with more demanding safety regulations? And should China end the practice of transporting virus-laden guano from sparsely populated regions to population centers, as appears to have been the case in Wuhan? One might also ask, should studies of Ebola or other outbreak-ready pathogens be carried out in Boston? As Alina Chan, a molecular biologist at the Broad Institute, told me this week, we may yet discover that the COVID-19 story is a variation on a small-town virus brought to the city and suddenly becoming a star. Or we might be due to a far more substantial inquiry into the risks of scientific research. If we're ready to acknowledge that a lab-induced pandemic is possible, and that we may be seeing the result, then we'll need to understand that the next major threat to public health could come from something else in biology. Something that destroys crops, or changes the ocean, or changes the atmosphere. Sam Weiss Evans, a biosecurity governance scholar, told me this could be the moment of reckoning for the much wider biological community. For the moment, though, these discussions are on hold while scientists chase, probably in vain, a full vetting of the lab leak hypothesis. They are not so process-obsessed when it comes to the spillover hypothesis, which, after all, is also wanting for direct evidence. So in the case of COVID-19, the Stanford University microbiologist David Relman, one of the organizers of the Science Letter, and a former colleague of Michael Imperiale's on the National Science Advisory Board for Biosecurity, told me this week that the research community already accepts that natural spillovers occur and that they can cause dangerous outbreaks, so it really doesn't need any further proof. Scientists are bound to push ahead with efforts to prevent and anticipate human encounters with animals that harbor potentially dangerous viruses, he said. That will happen almost regardless of what we learn now. Relman isn't expecting a similar approach to laboratory safety. The idea that a lab accident might cause a pandemic is a very difficult, uncomfortable scenario for many scientists to accept, he said. Without more specific evidence in favor of the lab leak hypothesis, People will wring their hands and talk about it just as they have since 2012, but I don't think a lot will change to reduce the risk. More scientific evidence may never arrive, even after further study by the CIA or the WHO. A proper investigation might, at any rate, prove counterproductive. What happens if it drags on into the future and never lands on anything concrete? What if no one can agree on what constitutes substantive evidence? Or what if researchers discover that SARS-CoV-2 really did begin in bats or pangolins or frozen meat? These outcomes wouldn't make the risk of lab leaks go away, yet they surely shrink the scientific community's inclination to address it. There's a probability of a lab escape, Imperiali told me, and we should act on it no matter what. We don't want to be asking these same questions again 10 years from now. At this point, calls for further investigation are as likely to become an instrument of delay as a persuasion. Now, it's interesting that all this is coming out now. I mean, we are roughly, we are about a year and a half into COVID-19, but I mean, it's interesting and intriguing just what comes up, but I mean, many Republicans have brought this up, and now we have Democrats backtracking. This coming from Headline USA. As COVID lab leak gains credibility, Dems try to cover tracks. They refused to release the evidence showing what it was, so because of that, they made this instantly political. After more than a year of dismissing and attempting to delegitimize any suggestion that COVID-19 escaped from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, Democrats and their media allies are now trying to cover their tracks. As the lab leak theory gains more credibility, Health and Human Services Secretary Javier Becerra recently called upon the World Health Organization to launch another independent investigation into the origins of coronavirus pandemic. The Biden administration claimed its rhetorical shift had come in response to newly emerging evidence that supported the lab leak theory. However, much of this evidence was available months ago. Like many conservative outlets, Headline USA reported as early as April 2020 on COVID czar Anthony Fauci's financial ties to the Wuhan Institute and the risky research it was conducting. The Trump State Department even published a report detailing the likeliness that COVID-19 escaped from the WIV because of the dangerous gain-of-function research, which involves scientists intentionally trying to mutate naturally occurring viruses into more contagious strains. Such research could be used to help discover new vaccines or to create deadly biological weapons. Nonetheless, mainstream media and big tech monopolies systematically suppressed any fact-based inquiries into the theory, even using phony fact checks to promote disinformation and Chinese propaganda. Despite, or rather because of, the damning evidence, pro-Chinese President Joe Biden promptly shut down the State Department's probe and refused to acknowledge its report. The cover-up began to unravel during a May 11 Senate hearing when Republican Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky grilled Fauci over the questionable funding that may have helped trigger the pandemic. Fauci admitted in the hearing that he did not have any accounting of what the Chinese may have done. Subsequent media reports have piled on even more evidence debunking the supposed Wedneday narrative, which claims the virus evolved organically outside the lab. I'm fully in favor of any further investigation of what went on in China, Fauci said during the May 10 hearing. On Tuesday, he went even further, admitting before the House Appropriations Committee that his National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases had partaken in a modest collaboration with China to research the transmission of coronaviruses from bats to humans. While the lab leak theory now appears to be gaining widespread traction, the White House attempted to downplay skepticism yet again. We don't have enough information to draw a conclusion about the origins, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki claimed on Monday, according to Summit News. We need data, Psaki added. We need an independent investigation, and that's exactly what we've been calling for. But many cast doubts on the reliability of our WHO-led probe. Given the corrupt health organization's clear conflicts of interest and its closeness ties to China, publicly the WHO has continued to insist that the virus originated in wildlife. Several left-leaning publications have now tried to walk back their initial opposition to the lab leak theory. PolitiFact was forced to update its fact check, claiming that the theory had been disproven, and Vox stealth-edited an old article supposedly debunking it. Graham tweeted out on Monday some of the stealth edits that Vox made to its article debunking conspiracy theories that COVID-19 originated in a lab leak between its original publication in March 2020 and now, and there's a Twitter picture of that. When asked why the media didn't take the lab leak seriously from the get-go, even though there was no evidence to discredit it, the New York Times' Maggie Haberman blamed former President Donald Trump for not providing evidence to back up the theory. Look, I think it's important to remember that President Trump and Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, both suggested that they had seen evidence that this was formed in a lab, and they also suggested that it was not released on purpose, Haberman said, according to Breitbart. Haberman and others in the media appear to admit that because Trump officials had made the allegation during a hotly charged election season, they reflexively sought to discredit it. They refused to release the evidence showing what it was, she said. So because of that made this instantly political. Trump responded this week by pointing out that he was right about the lab leak theory all along. Now everybody is agreeing that I was right when I very early on called Wuhan as a source of COVID-19, sometimes referred to as the China virus, he said in a statement. To me it was obvious from the beginning, but I was badly criticized as usual, Trump continued. Now they're all saying he was right. Senator Tom Cotton, Republican of Arkansas, who was one of the first high-profile proponents of the lab leak theory, also responded to the Democrats' flip-flop and blasted leftists for pushing Chinese propaganda. Tom Cotton tweeted out yesterday, because the media didn't like my politics, they lied to the public about the origin of COVID-19. They ought to be held responsible for covering up the Chinese Communist Party. And that is so totally true. I mean, look, 2020 was already going to be a contentious season because you had then President Trump going for his second term as president. He was impeached. He was brought up on false impeachment charges. Thankfully, the Senate acquitted him on that. Among other things, you also had many far left Democrats running for president, with Bernie Sanders, Kamala Harris, who is now vice president. You also had some moderates like Tulsi Gabbard, but for the most part, they were all, I would say, just barely to the left of Genghis Khan. And of course, you had the media spinning their false theories and premises on this. Speaking of the media, that brings us to this article from Willis Crumholes over at the Federalist. Wuhan Lab leak controversy illuminates why U.S. corporate media amplify communist propaganda. The time for complaining about the corporate media and shooting down every one of their lies is over. The time for action has come. As soon as COVID-19 appeared in Wuhan, China, it was a high possibility that the virus originated in one of the two high-security labs studying bad viruses in that city, the National Biosafety Laboratory and the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The Wuhan Institute of Virology was a particular concern. U.S. State Department cables in 2018 warned of extreme sloppiness in the lab. Although the lab's research on bat coronaviruses was partially funded by the U.S. National Institute of Health's National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, of which Anthony Fauci is the director, the warnings went undressed. Early in 2020, a paper by Chinese researchers at the South China University of Technology in Guangzhou said the virus probably originated from a laboratory in Wuhan, after a researcher was infected by a bat urinating on or bedding the researcher. Of course, as soon as the outside world noticed, the paper was deep sixed by the Chinese government. A lab leak in China is nothing new. Back in 2004, a SARS outbreak in China originated from a lab. Generally, this shouldn't surprise anyone. As I wrote in early April 2020, this is the same government that forces abortions and turns millions of Uyghurs and packs warehouses in residential areas full of explosive chemicals. China's government-run economy pollutes so much that a huge chunk of its farmland is toxic. The Chinese Communist Party is equally indifferent to human life, corrupt, dangerous, and sloppy. Yet China's government, wanting to deflect from its likely ineptitude, spun lies about the origins of coronavirus. The Chinese Communist Party went on to blame a seafood market, the pangolin, and then the U.S. military. U.S. media immediately jumped aboard the seafood market claim, even though the Lancet Medical Journal shot down this explanation early on. China then persecuted and jailed scientists and doctors who spoke out about the virus. China also ensured the rest of the world felt its pain. Xi Jinping, China's president, shut down domestic travel but allowed unlimited persons to fly out of China. Immediately, U.S. corporatist media began, without evidence, to echo CCP propaganda that the virus leaking from a lab was a conspiracy theory. The Washington Post headline on the topic said, "Experts debunk fringe theory linking China's coronavirus to weapons research." In other words, the corporate media falsely conflated the realistic lab leak theory that a potentially tampered with virus escaped the lab due to poor safety controls, with the possibility that China was conducting bioweapon research at the lab. There is a concern that China is researching bioweapons, but it is much more likely that the coronavirus was irresponsible scientific research gone awry. Slade also falsely conflated the lab leak theory with the bioweapon theory. Then went one step further. The rumors of a lab escape or a bioweapon stem from historical amnesia, a caricatured villain, and good old-fashioned racism, wrote Slade. Of course, Chinese communist officials also played the race card with absolutely no pushback from the corporatist media. Reuters directly repeated Chinese propaganda, and Pierre conflated the lab leak theory with QAnon. Vox called the lab leak a dangerous conspiracy theory. Now this said it was a GOP conspiracy theory. The Associated Press described the lab leak as a falsehood. Business Insider ran a story about how crazy conservatives were to believe in the lab leak possibility. The far right has now found its own virus conspiracy theory, said CNN commentator Riri Zakaria. Often, corporatist media headlines on the topic drip with rage or superiority. Science clearly shows, ran a Forbes headline. Sorry, conspiracy theorists, ran an ABC's headline. Anthony Fauci just crushed Donald Trump's theory on the origins of the coronavirus. When a CNN headline from May 2020, the Daily Beast wrote that Bill Maher went on a hysterical rant only because Maher questioned the lack of real investigation or reporting on the pandemic's origins. Maher pushes bonkers. Steve Bannon, Wuhan Lab COVID conspiracy, read the headline. And there's this headline from CNN Politics. Friday, May 1st, 2020, Trump contradicts U.S. intel community by claiming he's seen evidence coronavirus originated in a Chinese lab. Now, in a sign of what was to come with the Hunter Biden laptop affair, Twitter banned the website ZeroHedge because the site posted about the coronavirus lab leak theory and included a document that contained the name of a Chinese official studying back coronaviruses at the Wuhan Lab. Of course, Twitter was alerted to ZeroHedge's misdeeds by a now-fired BuzzFeed reporter made infamous for posting online about his pederasty fantasies. Unsurprisingly, the corporate media cheered the ZeroHedge ban. A Chinese whistleblower and virologist, Li Mengyan, fled to the United States over her concern about the coronavirus being man-made and leaking from a lab. Naturally, only Tucker Carlson gave her the time of day. Tucker Carlson airs debunked conspiracy theory that COVID-19 was created in a lab, raged the corporate media response. Li Mengyan's mother was later arrested in China for her daughter speaking out, which prompted a less than sympathetic response in Newsweek. Other outlets ignored Li Mengyan's amazing story altogether. But in the face of more evidence, the lab leak theory has gone from conspiracy theory to a probable explanation. We now know that at least 3 lab researchers showed up in Wuhan's hospital in November 2019 with severe respiratory problems. Scientists have written how there is evidence that the virus came from a lab and was engineered, for reckless research purposes, to be easily transmitted between humans, called gain-of-function research. Worse, it appears that the U.S. government played a role in this research. Anthony Fauci, who again played a role in this funding gone bad, has gone from saying the lab explanation is a conspiracy theory to acknowledging the possibility that the virus escaped from a lab. Also revealing is the fact that China continues to prohibit outside researchers from investigating the origins of the lab, which stinks of a cover-up. What explains the corporatist media's repeating of Chinese propaganda without any evidence? Well, New York Times reporter Maggie Haberman blames Trump. In other words, because Trump told the truth about the issue, the media felt like it had to take the other side, which somehow in Haberman's mind makes it Trump's fault. This is deranged. The media saw Trump as such a threat to their power, and the globalist left that they took the opposite end of anything Trump said. Plus, China ostensibly causing the coronavirus pandemic only confirmed Trump's overall message on China. Yet more appears to be at play. Corporatist media outlets could have criticized the president on a host of pandemic-related issues without directly echoing Chinese propaganda, and corporatist media repeating Chinese propaganda or failing to report on stories damaging to China is nothing new. China's PLA Navy is controlling coronavirus, and aircraft carriers deployment proves it, ran one CNN headline. In 2013, China killed a story about the massive and ill-gotten wealth of CCP officials, then fired a reporter and tried to silence the reporter's wife. Throughout 2020, the corporatist media took China's unbelievably low infection numbers at face value and used those numbers to attack America's response. These are but a few examples. The most likely reason is simple, infuriating, and terrifying. Vox is owned by NBC, which owns MSNBC, which is owned by Comcast. Now, Comcast and NBC have business ties to China. Thomson Reuters has sales and offices in China. ABC is owned by Walt Disney, which has extensive ties to China. Now this is owned by Discovery, which has business in China. The Washington Post is owned by Amazon, which via Amazon News Services has ties to China. CNN is owned by AT&T, which has business ties to China. The analysis isn't as simple as examining a simple percent of company revenues either, because China's sales are often growing faster or are projected to grow faster. These parts of the business carry disproportionately more weight. The situation, the corporatist media knowingly repeating Chinese propaganda, represents no less than a national security threat. The headlines above only scratch the surface of countless Twitter accounts, television hours, and newspaper articles headlining the narrative created by only a handful of hugely powerful corporate monopolies. Wikipedia even has a COVID misinformation page with the lab leak theory featured prominently. Whereas the corporatist media's ties to China affect all other reporting. A reporter best make not himself unhirable at a corporate media organization by standing too far from the crowd. The damage is extensive. America lost an opportunity for national unity. Instead of a patriotic commitment to precautions against the virus, including mask wearing, then a quick and full reopening to not let China win, America split down party and cultural lines. Some Republicans incorrectly label the virus as not serious, while many Democrats use the virus as a tool to bully conservatives, repress their political opponents, and reward their allies. Equally bad, America initially had less knowledge about the unwillingness to question the World Health Organization's current China ties, and there are long-term effects of the virus we still can't determine. Obviously, the corporatist media are liars, but the time for complaining about the corporate media and shooting down every one of their lies and then this task is over, the time for action has come. What's required is a law pushed by the next Republican president that bans corporate conglomerates from owning news media organizations, or bans corporations from owning news media if that company has revenue tied to China or other authoritarian states. The status quo is completely unacceptable. It risks ripping the nation in two while hamstringing America's ability to respond to future crises. And that's definitely totally true on that part. It is time. I mean, we are seeing a lot of truth coming out that had been suppressed by the mainstream media. So let me know in the description down below what you think about this. Is the media now doing it an about face because they got caught? Do you trust the media? Do you agree that the lab leak theory is right? Leave your comments down below, and I'll see you in the next video. It's very rare that I do a topic for 5 days, but this is one of those rare occasions. There's still more coming out about the coronavirus Wuhan Lab leak and how mainstream media has been suppressing it, as well as social media. Got this article coming out from the town hall staff, and it says the truth about the China virus Wuhan Lab leak. So 2020 is a China virus spread across the globe, infecting millions and killing hundreds of thousands. Town hall reported on the latest information about COVID-19 spread, President Trump's plan to defeat it, and his efforts to develop new treatments, and most importantly, reminded readers where the virus originated, Wuhan, China. Now, while Town Hall reported on those questioning the lies coming from the Chinese Communist government and scientists at the Wuhan Institute of Virology about the coronavirus leaking from a lab, the left-wing media, Democrats, and Dr. Fauci bought into the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda, and anyone asking questions about a potential lab leak was labeled a conspiracy theorist. Now the left and Democrat media complex are changing their tune, saying that the lab leak has some credibility, but we were reporting the facts and real news first. April 14, 2020 is looking increasingly likely Wuhan coronavirus came from a lab bat. April 15, 2020, WaPo debunks their own story criticizing Tom Cotton for spreading conspiracy theory about Wuhan Lab. April 16, 2020, if Wuhan coronavirus escaped from a lab, China is responsible for every death and lost job. April 22nd, why the liberal media refused to believe that the Wuhan coronavirus came from a Chinese lab. September 12, 2020, Chinese scientists, I approve coronavirus was made in a lab. The mainstream media actively worked to suppress the truth on behalf of the Chinese Communist government. That is why your support for conservative journalism is so important. We bring you the truth while the mainstream media believes communist lies, and we cover the stories the left-wing media and Democrats don't want to touch. And there's also this from the federalistpapers.org. And it was actually published probably in the Western Journal. Reported U.S. mainstream media outlets accepted millions from Chinese Communist Party-controlled news agency. By Jack Davis of the Western Journal. A money trail connects several major establishment American publications with the news agency that spouts Chinese Communist Party propaganda, according to a new report. China Daily paid more than $1.6 million for advertising campaigns in Time, the Los Angeles Times, the Financial Times, and Foreign Policy, with a disclosure, or as documented by a disclosure form filed with the Justice Department. Time raked in $700,000 from the publication. The form noted another $1 million went to newspapers, including the Los Angeles Times, Chicago Tribune, and the Houston Chronicle, to print copies of its own publications. The form covers a 6-month period that ended April 30th. The spending reflects a long-term pattern of spending in U.S. publications. In June, a federal disclosure form said China Daily had spent nearly $19 million from 2016 to 2020 with American publications, the Daily Caller News Foundation reported. During that time, China Daily attacked former President Donald Trump's tariffs in the Des Moines Register. According to Voice of America, the ad was placed in 2018 as the 2020 presidential campaign was gearing up. The Justice Department requires some Chinese news companies to disclose their activities under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, according to the Washington Free Beacon. Beijing has a large toolbox for influencing media around the world, and its tactics have been evolving, especially since 2017, Sarah Cook, senior research analyst for China at Freedom House, told the Washington Post in January. Hold on a minute. The Free Beacon report noted that some publications have come under fire for publishing China Daily inserts entitled China Watch. These inserts run what looks like news with a strong pro-China slant. The outlet reported that the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post have stopped publishing China Watch because of its heavy dose of propaganda. Those publications were listed in the earlier spending report filed by China Daily, but not in the most recent one. According to the latest filing, the Los Angeles Times received $272,000 in advertising. China Daily paid $89,700 to the Los Angeles Times for printing services, and $164,000 collectively to the Chicago Tribune, the Houston Chronicle, and the Boston Globe. Jonathan Hasid, a political science professor at Iowa State University, said the publications are not all that successful. The Chinese Communist Party does not really fundamentally understand how Western societies and Western media works, he told VOA. They think that Western media just looks like the Chinese media, and so they try to influence them in the same way. This, of course, is a fundamental misreading of the situation, and fundamentally, I mean their credibility is poor around the world and growing worse. And that's that. So the mainstream media has been complicit in suppressing any truth pertaining to the origins of the coronavirus. And of course, we also have social media getting into it, with Facebook one of the main guilty parties. This coming from the Political Insider. Facebook lifts ban on posts about COVID-19 possibly being man-made. Back on February 8th, Facebook announced that it would restrict posts about claims about that COVID-19 might be man-made or manufactured. In other words, claims like, for example, that COVID was released or leaked from a laboratory in Wuhan, China. Now Facebook is lifting its ban, according to a Politico report on Wednesday. This tweet from Cristiano Lima was out on Wednesday. Scoop: Facebook will no longer remove posts claiming COVID-19 was man-made, as support mounts for probes into the virus's origins and the Wuhan Lab leak theory. Tip by Tech Meme. And it goes on to say Facebook ban and lifted in light of ongoing investigations. Politico reported Facebook will no longer take down posts claiming that COVID-19 was man-made or manufactured. A company spokesperson told Politico on Wednesday, a move that acknowledges a renewed debate about the virus's origins. The original ban came into being when the big tech company consulted the World Health Organization, but now, in light of ongoing investigations, the ban will be removed due to new debate around the true origin of the COVID-19 pandemic. Many commentators, including President Trump, have claimed for months that there was a possibility that the virus was released or leaked from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Such comments were banned from Facebook and ridiculed by the mainstream media. Time magazine explains in a headline how distrust of Donald Trump muddled the COVID-19 lab leak debate. What changed? Politico observed that President Joe Biden said Wednesday that he has ordered the intelligence community to redouble its efforts to find out about the virus's origins and report back in 90 days. Dinesh D'Souza tweeted out Wednesday night. For many months, Facebook used to ban the claim that COVID-19 is man-made as misinformation. Now they won't ban that same claim because they concede it's not misinformation. Doesn't it follow from these two facts that Facebook itself has been a purveyor of misinformation? Biden also revealed that the intelligence community is split between two theories about the COVID-19's origin, and said the review will examine whether it emerged from human contact with an infected animal or from a laboratory accident, Politico noted. Bipartisan support is also building on Capitol Hill for a congressional inquiry, the outlet also observed. Facebook has taken a hardline approach to anything it perceives as disinformation about COVID-19 throughout the pandemic. Steve Hank tweeted out Wednesday afternoon. Breaking: Joe Biden has given the U.S. intelligence community 90 days for a report on the origins of COVID, including specific questions for China. There is widespread speculation that the origin of the virus was a Wuhan Lab, not a wet market. And he tweeted out an article from the Wall Street Journal. The social media company said they put warning labels on more than 50 pieces of content in just April 2020 alone, based on articles from independent fact checkers. In light of ongoing investigations into the origin of COVID-19 and in consultation with public health experts, we will no longer remove the claim that COVID-19 is man-made from our apps, a Facebook spokesperson told Politico in an emailed statement. We are continuing to work with health experts to keep pace with the evolving nature of the pandemic and regularly update our policies as new facts and trends emerge, the spokesperson added. Yeah, so here we see that, yes, folks, even social media is coming around to what the president had made mention of over the past year. And there's this from the U.S. News and World Report. Facebook no longer banning posts calling the coronavirus man-made. This coming from Reuters. Facebook Inc. is no longer removing posts that claim the coronavirus that causes COVID-19 was man-made amid renewed debate over its origins. In light of the ongoing investigations into the origin of COVID-19, and in consultation with public health experts, we will no longer remove the claim that COVID-19 is man-made from our apps, said a Facebook spokeswoman in an emailed statement. We are continuing to work with health experts to keep pace with the evolving nature of the pandemic and regularly update our policies as new facts and trends emerge. The rule change, first reported by Politico, comes as U.S. President Joe Biden announced he ordered aides to find answers to the origin of the virus. He said on Wednesday that the U.S. intelligence agencies are pursuing rival theories and potentially including the possibility of a laboratory accident in China. Social media companies have faced pressure to combat health misinformation on their sites during the pandemic. Facebook has said that it has removed more than 16 million pieces of content from its apps for breaking rules on COVID-19 and vaccine misinformation. The company announced in February that it had expanded the types of claims it would remove from its platforms, including that the virus was man-made. The Facebook spokeswoman said the company regularly updates the list of claims it removes based on the advice of health experts, and there is a bit.ly link right in the article. COVID-19 has killed more than 3.6 million people worldwide. The first reported cases emerged in the central Chinese city of Wuhan in late 2019, but the origin of the virus remains contested among experts. Earlier this week, U.S. government sources said a still classified U.S. intelligence report circulated during former President Donald Trump's administration that alleged 3 researchers at China's Wuhan Institute of Virology became so ill in November 2019 that they sought hospital care. The source of that early intelligence or how reliable U.S. agencies rated is not known. So yes, there is a lot that is coming out, and now even is still coming out. So I will definitely keep an eye on this in the weeks and months to come. I have the links to today's articles listed in the description down below. And while you're down there, take a minute and tell me what you think about Facebook lifting the ban on the post. What do you think about the mainstream media suppressing all of the news and research about this back in 2020, but are now coming around to it? And I'll see you in the next video. And that's going to do it for the news for this week. I am Bulow. Again, if you like what you watch, please go ahead and hit the thumbs up button. Also subscribe and tell your friends, tell your neighbors, tell an enemy or two even. And I will be back next week. Until next time, peace.